Hello, and welcome to Working with ELL Writers, one of the SLCC Writing Across the College Transforming Talk videos. These videos take an in-depth look at fundamental issues in writing instruction at SLCC. They can be watched individually or can provide the basis for deep conversations about how we use writing pedagogies to foster student success. All of us want to help ELL writers succeed, but few of us know how to do that well. In this Transforming Talk, 4 ESL and composition faculty members explore the circumstances that ELL writers encounter in college writing and provide effective strategies for improving the ELL writing experience for our students. First of all, let's clarify some acronyms that will be used in this video: ESL and ELL. While ESL, English as a Second Language, is probably the more familiar term of the two to people outside of the field of English language learning and teaching, it assumes that English is the second language that a person is learning, which can be problematic because in reality, many students in ESL courses use multiple languages already. This second language assumption derives from the norm of monolingualism in the United States instead of multilingualism. Although this is changing very slowly across the nation, if a person grows up in an English-speaking household, there is currently little motivation to learn another language to fluency, unless career or faith-based goals or personal circumstances necessitate it. For the purposes of this video, ESL will generally refer to instruction in English that takes place in an English-speaking location. ELL will refer to English language learners, or students whose first language is not English and who are not yet proficient in English. The writing done by ELL students will be referred to as ELL writing. The motivation for this transforming talk arose from the apparent misalignment between the stated SLCC value of inclusivity and the results of a Writing Across the College program survey that was distributed in fall of 2015. In that survey, faculty and students were asked to agree or disagree with multiple statements regarding writing assignments. More on that survey and the resulting document can be found in the Transforming Talk, Writing Assignments, What Students and Faculty Should Expect. One of those statements was, students who are English language learners have a right to have their writing evaluated as that of a language learner, not as a native English speaker. While 88% of students agreed with that statement, only 54% of faculty did. This response calls for Salt Lake Community College to begin a conversation about writing from English language learners. The WAC mini video, What Not to Do with ESL Writing, scratches the surface of the teacher-student relationship, and this transforming talk extends it. There are no easy answers to the complexities of ELL writing, but talking about those complexities can move us towards a more inclusive college community. First, let's meet our experts on the issue of English language learners and writing.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Johnston, and I'm an assistant professor. I teach developmental English and linguistics here at Salt Lake Community College.
Hello, my name is Ann Fillmore, and I am an assistant professor that has been working with ESL students for the last 10 years, and I teach developmental reading and writing.
Hi, I'm Marlena Stanford. I'm an assistant professor also, and I've taught English language learners for several years, and I also teach developmental writing.
Hi, I'm Ann Canavan. I'm also an assistant professor. I teach ESL pronunciation, composition for ESL, linguistics, and a variety of other courses.
These faculty members were asked to discuss 4 issues related to ELL writing that explore assumptions, evaluation, systemic disadvantages, and how to help ELL students succeed. Let's start with assumptions. What assumptions do we faculty tend to have about ELL writing?
So the deficit, oftentimes as professors, when we're evaluating student work, we look at what the students can't do rather than what the students can do. So it's like if you're grading an objective test, you're marking things wrong as you're going through instead of like marking things right as you go through. Reading papers, we do the same thing. We look at, oh my God, there's, they can't, put the S on, third person singular and get all flustered about it instead of looking at what the students are communicating and how much knowledge they have about their subject.
I think that's absolutely right, because we miss so many interesting things that we'd never thought of them being able to do. So the deficit model, we're only looking for the errors instead of saying, wow, I never considered somebody taking it in this direction. And a deficit model kind of stops us from being able to reward that sort of behavior.
We encourage students to take risks, but so often all they've heard is the mistakes they've made, that they're really self-conscious about that, I think, and so we want them to take risks, and so focusing on the strengths is a good thing.
And I think that's especially true for our ELL writers, because they're very concerned about grammatical things, and they're like, okay, well, the safest thing for me to do is write simple declarative sentences, subject, verb, object, over and over again, because they're worried about a deficit model grading, so they stick to what's safe. And it gets boring, it gets repetitive for us and them.
And one thing to point out too is that sometimes we even make judgments about the English language learner's writing before we actually even read it and begin to assess it. So we have to think about what kind of judgments or what value system are we going to when we actually sit down to read an English language learner's paper.
Let's now move to evaluation. The WAC survey results suggest that nearly half of our faculty believe that ELL writers should be held to the same language standards as native English speakers. Why is that? And to what extent should language proficiency impact writing evaluation?
I think one of the things that's important to talk about when we talk about the way that English language learners acquire a language is that we don't get the 4 different kind of areas of language acquisition at the same time. Typically, reading tends to come fairly quickly to people because we can kind of guess our way through it to some degree. We have words that look similar or things like that, and it's a passive skill. We're not producing anything. Listening is the same kind of a thing, where we're passively taking it in, we can guess. But speaking, people tend to get relatively quickly because, particularly when they're like here, they're using English in a survival kind of a way.
Especially conversational speaking.
Absolutely. But writing tends to be the most difficult for anybody who is learning a language. If we think back to when we were all learning second language, I know my writing is terrible in any other language. So there's so many moving parts to writing. We have prepositions, we have verb endings, we have adverbs that sometimes go before and sometimes go after. And there's just so much detail involved in writing. But of course that's what we tend to assess the most of in our classes. So I think that's where we see the accent that we kind of talked about. What do you guys think about that?
Well, we know that in language acquisition, those little grammatical areas that you were talking about are often late acquired. And it's probably because when we're speaking and even when we're reading, those things are not emphasized or they don't stand out to us. So we're going to get our nouns and our verbs first because as we're reading or as we're listening, we're picking up on that because those are the content words. That's information we need to know. And then how that native speaker, linked it all together is secondary. So that's going to be acquired later. And yet, oftentimes that's what we focus on when we're looking at someone's writing.
Yeah.
It also makes me think about kind of the cultural distinctions among English language learners and native English speakers, and the genre conventions that a native English speaker might already be very familiar with that English language learner might not be so familiar with, and that plays a role in what their writing looks like and what comes out on paper too.
Yeah.
These are interesting points. As you were speaking, I was thinking that even the way that students write introductions on their papers are vary so much culturally,
Yeah.
right? And what I love is if you can look at the way that the students express themselves in writing, and that transfer of their native language and culture and way of thinking comes through in their writing. And it's like a window into how they're viewing the content, how they're processing information. But just the way that they introduce their papers can be so creative or poetic, and it's so different than what we generally teach, students in K-12 here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, English tends to privilege very direct sort of writing. We're not a very metaphorical language in terms of flowery idioms and kind of poetic things. So it does throw us off as readers when we encounter students who do it. In the same way that prepositions can throw us off. I often tell my native speakers that if you were not born into an English-speaking family, you couldn't use prepositions either, because they're not rule governed. We go, in a car, but on a plane. If you're on a plane, something terrible is about to happen to you if you think about prepositions literally. So, these kinds of things that do strike us as native speakers when we're reading, but we have to think about kind of the deeper reasons why. And I think I always come back to asking ourselves, well, what's this doing for the content? Is this really changing whether or not they're achieving the main goal I want in this assignment? So I think a lot of when we're talking about this kind of written accent needs to come back to, well, is it preventing them from achieving what I want for this assignment? Are they still meeting the goal of it?
Yeah. Could I say one more thing on reading?
Absolutely.
I'm just thinking in my Spanish studies that now I can pick up something in Italian or French or Portuguese, and you can make your way through it. Same with like directions to something. You can often look at the French and say, oh, but we're such skimmers culturally now. We're reading online and we're skimming, and so does anyone really pay attention to those extra words?
That's a good
I know
question.
I'm not. I'm a terrible skimmer. I mean, I'm a good skimmer, but I skim everything. I'm not paying attention to those meaningless words.
Yeah, it's true.
Let's think about systemic issues now. SLCC places a high priority on serving diverse communities and values inclusivity and equity for all students. However, the opinion that ELL writers should be more proficient in English before entering into transfer-level courses is commonly expressed. So much so that this appears to be a systemic rather than individual issue. Do ELL students experience systemic or institutional disadvantages in their education?
Okay, so for institutional disadvantages, I think some students with their self-confidence also, some students try to prolong the ESL series, definitely. But others, really, we should be trying to accelerate them and getting them into real life situations with all kinds of speakers, because that's the world they live in. As for some institutional disadvantages, many of the students are not familiar with the U.S. System of higher education. We're getting some for the first time, or some that have been in language schools, which is a totally handheld process. So to come to Salt Lake Community College and have to do things independently, like go to the registrar, go to the cashier, go, all this system, and you have to go get a parking pass from another building that's not even really on campus, It's hard for faculty and staff to figure that out the first time we get here. So, yeah, that could be very different. Also, the notions of collaborative learning and group work. I often hear students say, I'm 21 and I have never once worked in a group. So it's just how to work in a group, or how a group should function together, the roles of leaders in the group, all of that could be new. And also people just may not listen, I feel, to our students as well, because of those prejudgments that people have, like, especially if you do hear an accent in their spoken English, people may just direct students to ELL resources or to the Academic Literacy Center or whatever. So, can you guys think of any more? There's so many more.
Okay, so it also makes me think in terms of institutional disadvantages about the length of time that it takes to learn academic language versus conversational everyday language. And if a person has been in the country, in the United States for 3 or 4 years maybe, perhaps they haven't yet really acquired the academic language. However, they need to be in the higher education system. We can't keep them out of that system.
Right.
They need a chance to actually learn academic language. How do they do that? By being mainstreamed into our courses, into our college courses.
I think one of the other things I've seen with our students is not being aware of the resources that we have available to them, either on the very basic level of, I've had Chinese students tell me, we don't like to ask our teacher questions because we think we're telling the teacher that they didn't teach well the first time, that there's an implied insult there. So they tend to be less forthcoming when they're asking questions. Also things like writing centers, the academic literacy center, these are very much not unique, but very centralized in the US higher education system. So China does not have writing centers in their colleges, although there are some emerging literally in the last 5 years. So they don't recognize what resources we have to facilitate success or where to go find them. So we have to work harder, I think, on kind of emphasizing the things that are there to help them succeed, that they don't have to go it alone.
And I want to make one point again about the difference between language, learning a language and acquiring a language. So oftentimes in ESL classes, in the ESL sequence, students are learning an awful lot about the language and learning an awful lot about the culture. But that doesn't mean that they can jump into a class and be perfect. They can't access all that learning. It has to settle. They have to experiment with it. They have to go out and they have to actually use it in a true communicative kind of setting for them to truly acquire the language. So the weird thing is, or the institutional disadvantage, is that we expect students to come to our classes prepared in whatever we've decided is prepared, and yet they can't get prepared unless they actually do it. So it's kind of a catch-22 for most of our immigrant and refugee kind of students.
Yeah.
Right.
To finish, let's end on a positive note and ask what SLCC faculty can do to improve the writing experiences of our ELL students.
I think the number one thing that we can do as teachers in any subject to help English language learners in their writing is to be generous readers. So if we read for meaning, just like we listen to English language learners when they have an accent, we listen to them and we listen for meaning, and we worry about that more than we worry about all the little mistakes that they might make. Then we actually can value what the English language learner is saying. So just as we do that in conversation, we should be generous with our reading.
I think that's very true, just as I think a lot of us have had experiences where we've traveled and to a country where we've learned the second language. We hope that they're going to be generous listeners to us as we speak French so badly people ask if you're German, for instance. Not that that's ever happened to me. But I think being generous and knowing that that doesn't mean watering down the standards for the assignment, but asking yourself, well, what am I valuing here? Right. How well are they getting at the heart of what I'm asking them to do?
Yes, that's one thing too that I think is important that we can do to help English language learners, is that we really don't automatically assume that a difference in writing is an error in writing, that we look at difference in writing and we can see that sometimes that is actually a rhetorical choice that the student is making. And sometimes it's actually really creative, and I think Anne had brought that up earlier. So it's important to not automatically assume that a difference in writing is an error in writing.
On that same note, many students are not used to writing to an American audience. And they may not be writing, that's not their goal. They, if they're international students, they may be here to pick up, a degree, but their ultimate goal may be to go somewhere abroad, or go back to their native country or something. And so they may be really presenting their thoughts to that audience. We're just not familiar with that either. And I think another thing to consider is maybe reading through writing first before marking anything or using your rubric. Go through and really try to understand it, and also not weighing the grammar so much on your rubrics. Usually I only have grammar worth like 2 points on, I still go through and work on it, depending on the assignment, 25, because they may get 0 on that, but it's not going to affect their grade, and I'll still go through and the student can revise, and I'll still mark the grammar and we'll still work on it, but it won't affect their grade. They won't take a hit, because really we're looking for those ideas.
Well, and you're still indicating that there's a challenge there
Exactly.
that they need to adapt to, but it's not going to prevent them from passing the assignment, so.
Yeah, something that we've been thinking about a lot is creating low-risk assignments, like low risk to their grade, but that allows them to get that practice, that they can experiment and they can, experiment with the grammar of English and their own voice and things like that, but, without it being a big hit on their grade if something goes horribly awry
And
in
I
what
think
they're doing.
practice is, I think, the key word there, because a lot of people say it takes 7 years to be fluent in a language, depending on how much you're using it and under what circumstances. Other experts say you never get to native speaker proficiency. So, but the more opportunities we can give them to practice, the better they're going to get. And we need to not say, oh, I just don't want to grade this much or this kind of thing. We need to think about, well, how can we give them opportunities to practice that are still compatible with our grading loads and being the best instructors that we can, but that we balance those kinds of things.
Essentially, I feel that it's kind of a value shift. Often teachers in the United States don't actually know very well multiple languages. Many are monolingual, and even if they know more than one language, they might have kind of a monolingual mindset, and that everyone in the U.S. should be able to write and speak like the native English speaker does. So if we kind of shift to a more multilingual mindset or value system where we see that actually knowing more than one language is a resource, and using those languages in writing is actually a resource, then we'll start grading differently and start assessing writing in our classes differently too.
Yes.
This is just a start, but hopefully it is the beginning of some meaningful discussions about ELL writing at our college. If you are interested in looking more closely at how to support student writing in your classes, consider registering for other videos and workshops through the Office of Faculty Development, or contact the Writing Across the College director at wac@slcc.edu, call extension 3232, or check out the website at www.slcc.edu/WAC.